Hello and welcome to the Author's Anvil and to this episode of Foundations of Writing. The aim of this series, and this channel in general, is to help writers compose their works, whether that's in fiction, non-fiction or business. For this episode though, we're going to be focusing on fictional writing, and our topic for today is about what I believe are the three central pillars of storytelling, which are character, plot, and theme or purpose. No matter what kind of story you're telling and through what medium, I guarantee that it will have these three elements, whether you're recounting a funny work story to your friends at the pub or composing an epic fantasy saga. Every story has at least one character who goes through a series of events, which is called a plot, and behind this series of events is a purpose or a theme. In this video, we're going to explore each of these three pillars in much more detail, and hopefully by the end we'll have a checklist of things we need to think about when composing our stories. We've got a lot to cover today, so let's get right to it. First of all, I want to talk about character. I would define a character as simply an entity that exists in a story. This definition gives writers the opportunity to put any kind of being into their work, whether that's your average human, an animal, an artificial intelligence, or even something abstract and supernatural. There are countless articles and videos online that can give you templates and advice for creating a character, but I always find a lot of these templates are pretty skin deep. Yes, it's cool to think about what your character does for a living or whether they have a verbal tick or quirk, but in my opinion there are actually three things that are much more important to work out about your character before you start writing them in order to make them interesting and deep. The first thing is something you've probably heard before, but I've got to touch on it because I do wholeheartedly agree with it, but you need to think about motive. Why is a character doing something in your story? What drives your hero to help people? Why is your villain acting against the hero? Motive, or as some others call it, desire or wants, is a key ingredient for driving your plot forward and also establishing stakes. More on this later. I think it's really interesting, however, to not only think about conscious motives in characters, but unconscious motives as well. Take Walter White from Breaking Bad, for example. His conscious motive for getting into the drug trade is that he wants to provide for his struggling family. But what makes Walter really interesting is his unconscious motive for doing what he does. Walter White is incredibly prideful and bitter about the lost opportunities of his past, and his journey into becoming one of the most feared criminals in America is motivated by his desire to make something of himself, to be respected. It's only really near the end of the show that he and we become aware of this unconscious motive, and it's a really poignant moment for the character. But anyway, moving on to our next character ingredient, I want to talk about fears. Fear is something that is a fundamental human experience, and no matter how brave or badass someone seems, there is always something that makes them afraid. Think about this fear. You can use this fear as part of the character's motive, or as a thing to make them relatable to the audience, or as an obstacle for them to overcome, or even for comedic effect. A good example of this is Indiana Jones and his famous fear of snakes. I think this fear, while used a lot of the time as a joke, also grounds him as a much more realistic person. I think we as the audience would find him annoyingly flawless otherwise. He's already intelligent, good looking and generally badass, so having him have to overcome his fear of snakes in his line of work is a really simple but effective way of nerfing his character. But anyway, however you choose to use fear, just make sure that your character has one. The last thing that we need to think about when creating deep and interesting characters is their pain. Yes, I know I sound like an edgelord, but hear me out here. Pain, both emotional and physical, is something that yet again is a fundamental human experience. Everyone has suffered an injury or has gone through a degree of mental trauma growing up, and bittersweetly this is something that binds us together. Your character's pain makes them relatable and can inform us as to why they have the personality that they have. When we first meet someone like Guts from Berserk, he's very cold, unsociable and aggressive. It's only when we get flashbacks to his horrific childhood being raised by an abusive mercenary company that we understand why he is the way he is, and thus begin to sympathise with him. If a past trauma is not appropriate for your character, however, I would instead recommend putting one in for them at some point in your story. For example, Simba from The Lion King is an innocent child who has been raised as a prince for his entire life. It is therefore even more impact and gut-wrenching when he goes through the frankly horrific experience of watching his father die and thinking that it was his fault. This pain makes the audience root for him, not only because we feel really bad for what happened to him, but because we want to see Scar, the villain, see justice for the pain that he caused our main character. How a character reacts to pain, and how they come back from it, is a great way of putting them on a character arc, which makes their story even more compelling. You may have already noticed this, but can you see how these three things, motive, fear, and pain, can be linked together in meaningful ways to craft a multi-layered character? Let's take Spider-Man for example. Spider-Man's main pain is the loss of his beloved Uncle Ben at the hands of a criminal that he could have stopped earlier that day. This motivates him into using his great power for the great responsibility of keeping people safe from criminals. This pain also developed the fear of losing someone else close to him, which creates a lot of tension and stakes in his stories. Think then, for your own character, about how the three things that we've just talked about can be linked together and how they can play off one another. So that's the pillar of character covered. We want to always think about their motives, fears, and pain. Maybe start with thinking about who your favourite characters in fiction are, and how the writer fleshed out the above in their works, then that might give you inspiration for your own characters. The second pillar of storytelling is of course plot. You might have a neat concept or idea for a story, but you're not quite sure how to make it compelling or flesh it out. Well, here are some things to add to your story crafting checklist. First of all, let's get the conflicted elephant out of the room. The main driving force behind every story is conflict. Conflict, in its most literal definition, is when two opposing things come against each other for a prolonged period of time. These things can be anything, from a superhero going up against a supervillain, to a human going up against a force of nature, or simply some characters having a philosophical debate. Conflict is essential to keeping your audience engaged. Conflict is what gives your characters obstacles to overcome and enhances their motive in the story. Your plot should have a central conflict, which is the main plotline of the story, and then should have lots of little conflicts that contribute to this main one. For example, the main conflict of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is whether the free people of Middle-earth can destroy the Dark Lord Sauron's source of power, the One Ring, before he enslaves them. This main conflict is then broken up into many little conflicts that contribute to this main one. Frodo and the Hobbits have to go against the Ringwraiths to get the ring to Rivendell. The Fellowship of the Ring have to escape Moria. Rohan and the Ents have to defeat Saruman. Gondor has to survive a siege from Mordor, etc, etc. Always keep your main conflict in mind when plotting your story. And just another little tidbit of advice here, but I always find it's really helpful to put a time limit on your story. Make your heroes, or make your main characters, have to do something, have to complete the plot, in a set amount of time. This not only gives the audience a good taste of suspense and tension, which we'll talk about later, but it's also a useful tool for you as a writer, because now you have to come up with ideas as to how they're going to be able to complete this task or this plot within that time limit. But anyway, this actually dovetails quite nicely into the next building block of our plot, stakes. Stakes are what the characters in your story have to lose, which thus creates tension, which thus deletes boredom. Stakes can be as simple as a character getting hurt or losing their life, or can be as complicated as attaining the custody of their child during a messy divorce. Whatever stakes you have in your story, and it's good to have multiple, just make sure that they are as linked to your character's motives as possible, and that they are made clear to the audience. So when you have your character motives and the stakes of your story established, the next building block of plot, which you'll hopefully be building anyway, is suspense. Suspense is simply the idea of keeping your audience uncertain as to how an event will unfold, which again builds on the idea of creating that tasty tension we talked about earlier. This sounds like obvious stuff, but a piece of advice I'd like to give is that it's a really good idea to give your audience an event to look forward to in your plot. Don't take this to mean that you need to tell your audience precisely what is going to happen, but at least give them a teaser or a promise of what is to come. For example, in Kentaro Miura's Berserk, we have supernatural characters talk about a mysterious event called the Eclipse that's going to take place sometime in the near future. We, as the audience, have no idea what this eclipse is and what it will mean for our characters, so we're now kept in suspense as to what will happen further down the line. Moira has promised us that this foreboding event will happen, but he has not revealed how it will happen. Last note for this plotting section, but I'd also just like to quickly point out the idea of mystery with suspense. We humans are very curious creatures by nature, so creating mystery is a really powerful tool to use in your plot. Having your characters trying to solve an in-story mystery is another great way to drive your plot forward, as you can come up with clues and investigative scenes. Solving a mystery can also link back to what we talked about earlier with character motivation. So we move on then to our last and most abstract pillar of storytelling, theme. At the start of this lecture, I lumped theme and purpose together, and the reason I did this is because I think in the context of storytelling they are synonymous. A theme really is just a central idea, subject, or topic that is present in a story. Every writer, whether they are conscious of it or not, has an agenda and a purpose for telling their story. Like with a lot of things I've said in this lecture, a theme can vary hugely in its complexity and type. When you tell a funny story to your mates in the pub, your intention is to simply make them understand a particular situation in order to make them laugh. If you want to comment on a real-world event or situation, but you don't feel safe to do so publicly, you might craft a fictional world that allows you to have a smokescreen between yourself and your audience. You might want to educate someone with a cautionary tale or an inspirational legend. Or you may simply want to entertain someone and provide an escape from our sometimes mundane and soul-crushing reality. Whatever your theme or purpose is, just make sure that you're fully aware of it and that it's threaded throughout your story. Your theme or purpose should be at the forefront of your mind when you're writing every scene. Think about how a character could represent an aspect of your theme, or how an event can bring your theme or purpose to light. Mike Flanagan's TV show, The Haunting of Hill House, for example, is an in-depth study of grief, with each of the 5 main characters representing a different stage of grief. Whatever theme you want to explore, however, just make sure you do some research into the topic and talk to people about your theme, especially if it deals with controversial topics. For example, if you wanted to explore gender equality, and you're a male author, you should probably talk to some women about their experiences with sexism, and vice versa, if you're a woman exploring gender equality, you should talk to some men about their experiences too. It's just common sense, folks. So there we have it, our 3 central pillars of storytelling and the main blocks that make them up. Character, plot, theme. Preferably, you'll have thought about all of these things deeply before you're starting your work, but if you didn't, then don't despair because there are always future drafts. There's a lot that's been covered here, and I hope that you're now having a bit of a running checklist of things to include in your story. Every writer will have one of these pillars that they build better than others, and also one that they build worse than the others. Like any craft, it's important for you to identify these strengths and weaknesses, and again, I hope the things we've covered today has given you an idea of what might be lacking in your story. It all might seem daunting having to think about all of this, but as with anything, the more effort you put in, the more you get out of it, and I'm sure I'm not the only one here who thinks that storytelling is worth every hour, every draft, and every word of your time. But John, you might be saying, you've missed out loads of stuff. What about setting? What about delivery and writing style? What about character development? What about genre? Well, while these things are all important topics, I think that they do fall into one of the above central pillars discussed in this video, and frankly, I'm planning to make separate videos on all of those things, so if you're interested in all that, I guess you'd better subscribe. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video, hope you learned something, and as always, I hope you keep writing.